So I'm afraid my conclusion is that whilst there's a lot wrong with the Online Safety Act, the online right and Conservatives have been completely played by big tech this week, as they were by big tobacco in the 1970s.
Hello and welcome to Spectator TV. Today we're going to be discussing the cover story of this week's magazine, which is about the Online Safety Act that's just been rolled out. To discuss that, I'm joined by John Power, who's written this as his first cover for The Spectator, and Miriam Cates, who is Senior Fellow at the Centre for Social Justice and a presenter on GB News. Now, John, you've written this cover story about the Act that's just been rolled out in the last few weeks. You're fairly critical of a piece of legislation that at its heart is meant to be about protecting children, about stopping them accessing porn or other harmful material. Isn't this a good thing?
Well, as I outlined in the piece, I'm not sure the real reason for the legislation is that people are trying to protect children. I think the purpose behind it is slightly more sinister than that. The real appetite for reducing online harms begins in the late 2010s. It begins after Brexit and it begins with Donald Trump. That is when what you might call the establishment or the elite in Western society really sours on the internet. They were very optimistic about the internet in the 2000s and early 2010s. They thought Facebook would be the social revolutionary platform. But when it became clear that the social media could actually be an engine for social change or political change, it became very unpopular. The online harms paper, which preceded this legislation, which was first published in 2019, I believe, under Theresa May, it was partly to really, one of those main focuses was to reduce abuse that MPs were facing on social media. This has been a kind of monomaniacal obsession of both the commentariat and MPs, especially of a certain age, who, when they first get their social media platforms, are surprised to find out that people are allowed to abuse them without using their real names. That's really what this legislation is about. I think, unfortunately, and although many people who advocated for the legislation, I would include Miriam in this case. I think they didn't have those intentions. I think they were interested in protecting children. But you have to remember that a lot of the groups that lobbied for this, such as the Centre for Countering Digital Hate, they see the online world as an enemy, and they see it as something that they need to censor in order to have a social stability and to maintain the current social political order. I think that's really where a lot of the enthusiasm for this legislation comes from.
And just before we let Miriam respond to the point you make there, you outlined some examples of where the sort of censorship aspect of this bill, or rather the part of the Act that is about age restriction from content, is now being used to censor things that otherwise shouldn't be censored. Do you have some examples of where it's going wrong? Yeah,
there are two clear examples that have come up, both on X over the last week since legislation has been implemented. One of them is a speech made in Parliament by Katie Lamb, where she read out transcripts from trials from grooming gangs. This has been, it's not exactly censored, but basically, access is limited to it. But I think the more pressing thing, or the more egregious case, was footage from a protest in Leeds outside the Hotel Britannia. This has also been limited, and why this protest showed basically police officers getting rowdy with some protesters. And I think why this is so pernicious is it's applied to a live event. And, the argument that the Centre for Countering Digital Hate, which was set up partly by Morgan McSweeney, who is an advisor at Number 10, they argued during the last year's protest that Ofcom, which is the body that's empowered by the Online Safety Act, should be given emergency powers in order to limit what social media companies are allowed to publish when there is something like the Southport riots and unrest going on like that. So you can see that the OSA, which was kind of pitched as being something about protecting children, how in practice legislation can be used as a way of dampening down dissent and stopping things spreading online and discord and protests from occurring.
And Miriam, John's mentioned your support for the bill both here and also in the piece. Do you still stand by that this is a good piece of legislation?
Well, I've never said it's a good piece of legislation. It's massively overcomplicated. It has a lot of flaws. I do have two major concerns with it that I mentioned at the time, and many others did, but neither of those John has mentioned in his piece. And in fact, most of the commentary online has missed those two major concerns, and we can come on to those later. But I think John's just given a brilliant libertarian defence for why we shouldn't try to regulate big tech. But I'm conservative, and I think big tech is a massive international imperial power. I think big tech cares about big tech. I don't think big tech cares about free speech, doesn't care about free expression, certainly doesn't care about national sovereignty or the British state. And whilst the internet has brought many, many benefits, and so has social media, it has also, exactly as John said, very much disrupted our society and created, particularly for children, an anti-culture that conservatives should be absolutely devastated about. I mean, there is no point in free speech if the children that we are raising are being raised in a culture of pornography and violence, and really the dismantling of everything that we would have called good and true and beautiful. What are we preserving free speech for if that is the culture that children are growing up in? Now, I'll be the first to agree that we should be worried about big state and the efforts that big state are making to clamp down on certain types of speech and opinions. That is absolutely true. That happened before the Online Safety Act. I was one of the few MPs speaking out against lockdown and compulsory vaccinations, and I absolutely agree. That happened, that did happen. I mean, the social media companies themselves were trying to do that. It wasn't just government. So I absolutely acknowledge that risk. But I think I disagree with John. The impulse originally for regulating what children see online was very much about child protection, and actually predating the Online Safety Act, and perhaps if it had worked, we would never have had the Online Safety Act, was the Digital Economy Act. And in 2017, Part 3 of the Digital Economy Act would have introduced very restricted age verification around pornography sites, which I think was exactly what was needed. The Online Safety Act probably should have stopped there. But the tech companies lobbied so hard. Of course they did. A third of the internet is pornography. It's unbelievably profitable for them. They lobbied so hard that the government didn't implement it. And that's when the government went back to the drawing board and tried to write another piece of legislation. And now we have this dog's dinner that is the Online Safety Act. Now, I agree it has flaws. And the two main ones are that Ofcom have written most of the regulations rather than Parliament. Parliament should have done that. And the second one is that the Secretary of State has some Henry VIII powers that could be used badly in future. They haven't been at the moment, but they could be used badly in future. So I think those are two key risks. But fundamentally, the core of the Online Safety Act is age verification. And that's something that conservatives and libertarians actually accept widely in everyday life. We know that you have to prove your age to buy alcohol. Yes, that's a friction for adults. Yes, that is limitation on adults' freedom, but we know that's necessary. And I think the idea that you have to prove your age to be able to see pornographic or violent material is a very, very sound one. And I object to the way the word censorship has been used when actually we mean age verification. Now, Katie Lamb's speech is a great example, huge democratic importance, brilliant speech, needed saying, but I'm not going to let my children watch it. Why should children be able to hear details of how young girls were penetrated by multiple men at a time? That's not suitable for children. It's not in any democratic interest that children hear that. That's not suppression. We should, as conservatives, welcome the fact that it's harder for children to come across that information. Now, there are some concerns about how you implement age verification that maintains people's privacy and doesn't give big tech more power. But isn't it interesting that Twitter, one of the most powerful companies in the world, has waited all this time to implement age verification, even though it actually says on their website that under the Online Safety Act and the Irish version and the EU version, we're not the only one to do this, they are going to implement a very simple version, which is just scanning your face. It won't hold any details. It won't do any more details than they already have. They could have done it months ago. But instead, they've chosen to undermine public support, political support on the right for age verification by posting these funny messages that are not censorship, they're just age verification. So I'm afraid my conclusion is that whilst there's a lot wrong with the Online Safety Act, the online right and conservatives have been completely played by big tech this week, as they were by big tobacco in the 1970s.
John, what do you say to that? Have you been played by big tech?
I don't think so. I think the kind of equivocation or the meeting in the middle that Miriam is hinting at, where there's a version of the Online Safety Act or age verification as a limitation for people accessing content, I don't think that world actually exists. I think that as soon as you introduce any sort of system that allows the government to decide who cannot access content online and who can access content online. And Miriam described me said I made a libertarian argument, so I'm going to make another libertarian argument. I'm afraid it is a bit of a slippery slope. We see this a little bit with people, and I'll say on Miriam's side, who talk about smartphone bans to broaden out discussion slightly. The kind of the idea is, in my view, the arguments advanced by people like Jonathan Haidt, who feel very strongly about this. They say that you should ban it in schools, but really what they want is what the Leader of the Opposition has called for, and what Miriam has herself endorsed after this speech was made, is a ban for people who owning smartphones when they're, I believe, under the age of 16.
Children.
For teenagers as well, but yeah, fine.
Children.
I think
in law, a child is under 18.
Sure. That's not the. I'm not even making an argument about whether or not children should have access to smartphones. So I think 15-year-olds probably can use phones. I don't think that's too much of a stretch, as long as there's some filters on what they see. The problem with allowing the state to have access to this sort of power is you just don't know where it will end. You don't know if once it becomes smartphones banned for under 16s or online access is restricted in some way. A lot of the arguments that are advanced in favour of protecting children could also be applied for people over the age of 16. And when you've ceded power, or you've given this power to the state, and that state is run by people like Morgan McSweeney, who have organisations like the Centre for Countering Digital Hate that they've been involved in, and they put forward reports and they believe that algorithms are radicalising everyone and that content is warping everyone's mind, then you can very easily see how what begins with 16-year-olds, and it's why I call it a Trojan horse in the article, can then be applied to the entire adult population. There's not really any rationale for not doing that once you've established that principle. So although I do accept a lot of arguments in Miriam Cates, and I've read a few of her articles before coming onto this, and she does outline the evidence case for pornography being harmful for teenagers very, very well, I do still believe that the step forward that we're making is opening a kind of Pandora's box that I think we should keep shut.
But John, that's exactly the argument. The argument that you use in your article is that we'll become like Russia and Turkey. But that's the argument that people opposed to leaving the ECHR use, is that, well, we can't leave the ECHR because then we'll become like Russia and we'll just go down this slippery slope of undermining human rights. I mean, that's not true to what the Online Safety Act already does. I'm not, as I said before, I'm not denying there is a risk of state censorship, and there always will be, and there always has been. But that's not what the Online Safety Act actually does. If you look at the bill itself, it's essentially about making sure that platforms remove content that is already illegal, and where there is a risk that children come across certain harms, pornography and violence, that they make sure they either get rid of that content or they introduce age gating. So the Online Safety Act, in those two elements, does not give governments any greater power. It's basically forcing social media companies to enforce their own user policies. Now, you can argue that's been done clumsily. You can argue that Ofcom have made a meal of it. All those things are true. But the way you, and not just you, I'm not picking on you, the way that many people have characterised the Online Safety Act is just not true to what the Act says or does. And I think there's a huge amount of misunderstanding about the Act itself, and it has been conflated with the other very worrying things that the state is doing, but are nevertheless independent on the Online Safety Act. I think it is a complicated Act, but I think there's so much misunderstanding out there. And, the basic inaccuracies like the confusion of age verification with censorship, but also there's other things like you and many others have pointed out, Kemi Badenoch was one of the only MPs to raise concerns, but Kemi and many of us raised concerns about one of the initial drafts of the Act where there were provisions against legal but harmful content. Now that was got rid of because of hers and others, including mine, concerns about it. Those things just don't exist in the Act anymore. And so it's just not accurate to say that Kemi Badenoch objected to the Act. She didn't. The Act as it is now, with those very concerning provisions removed, was not objected to because the government did the right thing. So I just think there's a lot of inaccurate information, but I think we should be thinking much more about why big tech wants to avoid regulation. And it's because they care about power and profit more than anything else. And I don't think there's anybody left who can argue that big tech don't know what they're doing to children. Frances Haugen's testimony, the Meta whistleblower to US Congress, which revealed that Instagram, for example, know how many 8-year-olds are on their platform, how many 9-year-olds are on their platform. They can tell you on average how many times a week an 8-year-old is propositioned for sex. They know that, and they could, at a stroke, kick all those kids off the platform, as YouTube have done, actually, very responsibly. So the Online Safety Act would not have come about had tech companies actually cared and been responsible enough to kick kids off their platform. But because they refused to do that, because they lobbied so hard, because they spent so much money getting the right on side and making this a freedom cause rather than a conservative cause, then they brought it on themselves. Now, I'm not saying the Online Safety Act is perfect, but the idea that the state, that our own British government should not be trying to clamp down on the power of a massive foreign multinational industry that's exploiting our children, as a conservative, I just can't stand by that.
And John, building on Miriam's point about big tech, it seems to me like your main concern with this is the potential for censorship. But that's not really the government or legislators' fault, isn't it? Isn't that over-interpretation by the people that are running Twitter, the people that are running these platforms? It's not the government that's sticking the badges on videos on Twitter to say they can't be shown. That's the platforms, isn't it?
Well, it's the legislation is written in such a way that there is such a brute tool, having these 10% global revenue fines, that you would expect people to overreact in that case for X, that's billions of pounds. So I just come back on a point that Miriam made earlier, and much of what you said is very skeptical of big tech, and I understand that. But you said earlier on in the interview or the discussion that you think that people in big tech don't care about free speech at all. And I just don't think that that's the balance of evidence is really in your favour there. I mean, Elon Musk, for all of his flaws, does genuinely believe in free speech. It's one of the principles that he has stuck to for the most part since he's taken over X. He took over X, he put forward that money to take over the platform. And he did that mostly with the purpose of protecting free speech, although I think in subsequent events, he obviously used it as a political tool to support Donald Trump. I suppose I have more faith in people like Elon Musk to at least maintain an absolutist stance on free speech than I do someone like Keir Starmer, who is part of a government that is now looking at how they can track using secret police squads to essentially track what people are saying online with arrests to follow. You sort of brought up earlier how I was comparing us to Turkey and China. And the reason that I do that is because in many senses, Britain's approach to free speech is as restrictive as a semi-authoritarian state. Hundreds of people have been arrested for tweeting things that are negative or were contentious about
but that's before the Online Safety Act. And I suppose that's my critique of your argument, that you can argue that those things are happening, and I won't disagree with you, but they are not being made worse by the Online Safety Act. They're already happening. And actually, the Online Safety Act tackles something very different, which you can disagree with, but are not actually, if you look at the detail of the Act itself does not make those things more possible. And actually, the Act includes protections for speech and content of democratic importance, of journalistic importance, and of political importance, which would actually make it impossible now for what happens during the pandemic. So, for example, during the pandemic, YouTube took down a debate in Parliament led by Christopher Chope that was sceptical about vaccines and talked about vaccine harms. YouTube took that down. Under the now implemented Online Safety Act, it's illegal for YouTube to do that because it's content of democratic importance. So again, there are flaws in the Online Safety Act, but there are also provisions in there that improve democratic safety.
But it's also established a principle, Miriam, that I'm very concerned about, and I think it will come back to bite people. You've talked a lot about conservatives and the right as a sort of movement, and I think the key thing that you're missing here is, although you might look down your nose that Elon Musk, I'm not sure, maybe you sneer at him slightly, is what he is enabled by purchasing X is a liberalisation in communications that, and I'm saying this as a journalist, observationally, as someone on the right, that's something you should be in favour of, because the society that you really want, although you are, as you say, a conservative, it requires quite a fundamental change in a lot of structures, and it will require, as you say, things like looking at the CHR. And I think to get there, you're going to need to have an engine to do that in terms of how people think and communications, and to kind of dismember the online world at this stage when the establishment is opposed to what you believe, and also takes hostile action constantly against you. I think it's a strategic mistake. Sorry, Miriam, let me finish. I also don't buy your argument that we can just see this as a piece of legislation that can only be analysed on its own terms and there will be no overreach. I mean, the examples of legislation coming in that's been exploited by the state to cramp down on what might be considered political dissidents, including the 2003 Miscommunications Act. But the examples are multivarious. I don't think that argument really holds that much water.
Look, as I said, there are many flaws in the Online Safety Act, and I have two very strong concerns about it that I've already said. I think the Secretary of State does have some Henry VIII powers in there to define what is illegal content in future, which do worry me. I'm not, as I said, I'm not defending the Online Safety Act in every single letter of the text. What I'm defending is the principle of age verification and the principle that national governments should be able to regulate international companies. Now, I agree that there are some good things about X and some good things about Elon Musk taking it over, but it's not black and white, because what Elon Musk also allows on his platform is massive amounts of pornography, some of it very extreme, and it's the number one place where children find pornography. And I think one of the problems with the argument that you and many others are making is that you paint this picture of Britain as having this strong history of freedom of speech and expression, and it being one of the basic planks of our society and our tradition. And of course, individual freedoms are a very strong part of British and Western European and American freedoms. But those freedoms have grown in a context where obscenity was illegal, pornography was illegal, social decency was required. We've always had obscenity laws. The Victorians enshrined them in primary legislation. We had further legislation in the 1950s. We always have had laws that prevent obscenity and pornographic publications from circulating in public. We don't have those anymore. It's a very American position to say that pornography is freedom of speech. It's not. There's nothing more undermining to conservative society than pornography, because it gets at the very heart of what holds our society together, which is good relationships between men and women and the ability to bring up children safely. Now, if you can separate pornography from free speech and get porn off Twitter and get porn off all the social media platforms, then I would agree with you wholeheartedly. Why do you need any restrictions on speech? You don't need restrictions on speech. But porn is not speech. Porn is the most appalling anti-culture that our children are growing up in. And Elon Musk, if he cared about freedom and freedom of children and freedom of women, he'd get the pornography off Twitter tomorrow. Why doesn't he do that? I think that is the question we should be asking.
And John, do you accept that point, that if there was some way to change the act, that your concerns were dealt with and it purely acted to stop children having access to porn, would you then be on board with it?
Well, of course. I mean, why would I? No one wants children to watch porn. It's just, the problem is that I don't think this piece of legislation, and Miriam has said that she doesn't think it's perfect. I don't think the piece of legislation exists that can do that. I think there are limits to what governments can do.
And then just before we finish up, you've obviously both got disagreements about the act, but I'd like to ask you both, do you think it's actually going to work? We've seen a surge in access to these so-called VPNs, which are a sort of geeky way that people can get round the age verification by pretending to be in a different country. Miriam, are you hopeful that this is going to achieve what you want to see and actually stop children accessing harmful content?
Yes, absolutely. I think the evidence is already there. The primary aim of this legislation is to stop children coming across pornography accidentally. I think it will do that. Of course, some people will use VPNs, but even if 10-20% of children download VPNs, you're still protected the other 80%, which is very similar to our laws on alcohol, for example. You're never going to stop all teenagers buying alcohol, but having laws in place and age verification does reduce the harms. And on a societal level, we should be very pleased about that. And I just come back to my point at the beginning. Age verification is not censorship. it is a very important plank of keeping children safe, and it does add friction for adults, of course it does. But I think everybody, including the most hardened libertarians, accept the fact that adults have to face some restrictions on their freedom and their ease of use of these platforms in order to protect children.
And John, on that same point, do you think that the government is even going to achieve what it wants to here?
Well, it may in the short term. I mean, obviously VPN usage will surge. Free VPNs, which are a huge problem that I don't think was really accounted for in this legislation, because the problem is that lots of children will be using free VPNs they can access online. They're not paid VPNs. And their business model is essentially to mine information, and that will create even more security risks that we haven't really touched on this in this discussion, but are also outlined in the piece that I wrote. I think that the reality is that the person right now who is polling ahead of every other political leader, Mr. Farage, and looks at this point most likely to form the next government, has made it a stern commitment to repeal the Online Safety Act. And I think there's a reasonable chance that, as you see people realising that now they can't access Spotify or they're being asked to use verification to use it, if there are a few data leaks that happen in the next 5 years, if the Chinese state turns out that they've created an age verification organisation online that people are using, and that this has been used to use blackmail, I mean, they're basically all of the kind of contradictions and the problems of legislation will play out over the next 4 years. But I can't say anything with any confidence, but I think that there's a reasonable chance that this will become very politically unpopular, and that in time we will see the legislation either abolished completely or parts of it that are most onerous repealed.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Miriam.